of Life, a course jointly offered through FAS, HDS, and the law school. You're welcome to sign up through any of those three. I am joined by Roberto Mongabera Unger. My name is Michael Pewitt. This is Steve Rizzo, who will be our teaching fellow. We very much look forward to what I think we can say will be an extraordinarily exciting semester. And what I can also say will be a very, very wild semester. So what I will do is start off by saying a few words about what we will be doing in this course, introducing some of the general themes, also discussing structurally how we will handle the seeming absurdity of what I'm about to say. I will then hand things over to Roberto, who will move us into a philosophical discussion of a lot of these key themes. And then again, we will conclude by going through a final set of logistical things and then opening it up. So in general, our format here will be Roberto and I in some combination and some order will make opening comments, and then we will always open it up for you for larger discussion. And even today, although you have no reading for today, we'll be generally following that. So let me begin by saying a few words about what this course will be about. You might think from the name of it, The Conduct of Life, that it would be the kind of ethics course that's typically taught in a lot of philosophy departments in America that would involve questions like, okay, let's imagine you're on an ocean liner that hits an iceberg and it sinks, but you get on a life raft and there are 4 of you, but there's only food for 3 people, and what do you do? And then the ethical discussion is, do you throw someone off? And if so, what is the basis by which you decide who gets thrown off? Or do you decide, no, we can't throw someone off because we can't throw away a human life, but then how do you live with the implications? Or do you come up with a consensus, and what would be the mechanism for that consensus? And then in such an ethics course, you debate which of those 3 options you would choose. In this course, on the contrary, we will be posing what we would call the deeper first-order questions. In the example I just gave, and next week we'll be saying a few more words about that example and when it arose, but very quickly, that example assumes, by the whole way it is set up, that there are a set number of individuals who make rational choices in a context in which nothing else is at stake. So that's the point of the example, is people are on a raft, you know nothing about them, you know nothing about the complexities of the world, so you take out the context, and how do a set of rational people make a decision? As we will be discussing next week, that entire way of framing an ethical question arose at a certain moment in world history. It arose in Euro-American philosophy over the past few centuries at a time, not surprisingly, when you were getting the emergence of liberal economic systems that were all based on the idea that you create markets that take out everything else, and you build a world where rational agents are competing over resources, and you debate how in such a world do people make decisions. In this course, we will ask, when and why would one think of the world that way? What are the implications of thinking about ethical questions in terms of rational agents within a marketplace? What are the dangers of thinking that way? And what are the other possible ways of thinking about humans, the human conditions, and how we can act in this world? In other words, we will be jumping across any period of world history that we find to be intellectually powerful, asking what have been among the most powerful articulations that we can find of the human condition and ways of wrestling with the human condition, what have been the implications of different ways of conceptualizing this set of issues, and all of this will be done in service of the question, what would we do were we to take these ideas seriously? We will therefore certainly think about the idea of rational agents in a marketplace, but we will radically contextualize that and ask, what are the dangers? Now, immediately this raises a clear question. Okay, if we're going to roam through world history, what, if any, structuring principle will we be using? And you'll question whether this is a really structural condition. However, there is some method to the madness that we're going to be embarking on. And that method to the madness is going to be based upon the following claim. Humans, for various reasons that we will be discussing at depth in this semester, have a very dangerous tendency to fall into patterns that can continue for not only our lifetimes, but societally for centuries and even millennia, part of the danger of the human condition. There have been moments when attempts have been made to radically rethink the world, and those will be the moments we will be focusing on in this course. Let me briefly mention 3 of these because this will be the structuring principle behind our course. The first of these happens roughly halfway through the first millennium BCE. This is a period when throughout all of Eurasia, the world had been dominated for about 3 millennia by powerful Bronze Age hereditary systems where all positions of power, all land, all resources were defined almost exclusively by birth. You were born into a certain position in life, aristocracy, warrior, peasant, whatever, and there you would stay throughout your entire life. The religions of this Bronze Age period were all based upon such an hereditary conception, and these societies, very hierarchical, purely hereditarily based, again, lasted about 3 millennia. For reasons we'll be saying a few more words about in 2 weeks, all of those Bronze Age kingdoms begin falling apart over the course of the first millennium BCE, and as they fell apart, you get this absolute fluorescence of philosophical and religious movements trying to radically rethink the world, asking, why did humans fall into this for so long? How could we re-envision our lives? How do we re-envision the way societies could operate? And what would that mean? Some of these are relatively well known for historical reasons we'll be discussing later in the semester by the way the Western canon has been constituted. But on the western side of Eurasia, this is the period when you get the emergence of the pre-Socratics, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Pythagoras, etc. At roughly the same time, this is the period in South Asia when you get the Upanishads, Jainism, the Buddha. At roughly the same time, on the eastern part of Eurasia, this is when you get Confucius, Lao Tzu, Mengzi, roughly contemporaries, all radically trying to rethink the world. This will be the first major moment we will be pulling our text from. This period comes to an end. This age of these extraordinary prophetic movements all ends because across all of Eurasia, huge Iron Age empires take over all of the regional areas I just mentioned. So at the western end, of course, the Roman Empire is formed. In South Asia, the Mauryan Empire. In the eastern side, the Han Empire. All of these either will suppress all of these philosophical and religious movements or appropriate key pieces, but key pieces for the sake of building an imperial legitimation, so radically domesticating what we would call the most powerful elements of these ideas. And this period of extraordinary opening is stopped. These empires, we would say, luckily for world history, begin to decay. And in the first few centuries of the Common Era, you see the second of these major moments we'll be looking at, the emergence of these radical salvationist movements. Many of them are actively developing in opposition to the empires I just mentioned. This is the period when you get the emergence, again going across Eurasia, of Christianity, Islam, Mahayana Buddhism, radical forms of extremely egalitarian religious Taoism, all again roughly the same time. We're talking roughly the first through about the 8th centuries of the Common Era. These extraordinary salvationist religions begin developing, many of them pulling from the ideas from the first millennium BCE, but radicalizing them dramatically. And sadly, this period also will come to a close. And for several centuries, you get, again, an appropriation and domestication of a lot of these ideas. The powerful visions that emerge during this period get strongly taken over by states, domesticated, and that will last for several centuries. And then another one opens up. The emergence of these radical, mainly secular ideologies that begin developing in what we now call the early modern period, but becoming radicalized, of course, in the 19th and 20th centuries, the emergence of communism, socialism, radical forms of democracy, an attempt, again, to radically rethink the world. You might think, okay, well, we're still living in this one, right? We will argue, no, that once again, we are now in a period, or have been in a period for several decades now, where this has largely been closed off. States, again, have pulled from these ideas, use all the terms I've just mentioned, but in a very radically domesticated form. And we offer this course out of a hope to re-engage these ideas in their most powerful ways, reinterpreted, obviously, for a very different period than they were developed originally, and that will be the structuring principle of this course. We will pull from what we consider to be some of the most powerful ideas that emerged during these three periods. First, halfway through the first millennium BCE, those first few centuries of the Common Era, and these 19th and relatively early 20th century revolutionary movements. We will pull from them. We will try to discuss some of these ideas in as much as we can, their most powerful formulation. We will not, as we do so, ask you to agree with these ideas. They would obviously disagree with each other, so you couldn't agree with them all. We will, however, ask you to take them seriously, by which we will mean, what if, to give an example we will be getting to in a few weeks, we were to seriously deal with the idea of the Buddha that we should be rejecting the self, not in a kind of domesticated form as it's done in corporate America, where we should meditate for 15 minutes in the middle of the workplace to calm ourselves down to return to work unchanged, but breaking the self. We won't call on you to do it, but we will absolutely call on you to think through the implications of such an incredibly radical idea. We will also spend less time, but it will be significant, asking when and why were these ideas, very much like the one I just mentioned, domesticated, because the ways they become domesticated are often telling, right? You don't domesticate any idea in any way. The ways that some ideas came to be domesticated may tell us something about the dangers of the initial formulations, and then we will spend lots of time looking at the different ways these ideas have been reread and reinterpreted at different moments, sometimes in a domesticated sense, but we'll obviously focus much more on the powerful rereadings and rearticulations. And our goal throughout will be, again, dealing with these ideas, or wrestling with them would be a better verb, in all of their power, and asking, what would it mean were we to take these ideas seriously now? How would we reread them and rework them? They would, by definition, have to be reworked for a different period, but what in the world will that mean? Now, having put it this way, this raises undoubtedly many other questions. Let me deal with some of the most immediate and obvious ones. So if that is our structuring principle, that may not sound like much of a structuring principle because, well, a lot of ideas have arisen during even those three periods. How in the world will we organize the course? Well, we will be honest. What we have done is we have organized it around what we consider to be incredibly powerful articulations juxtaposed in ways that we hope will be incredibly powerful in a challenging way to wrestle with. Meaning that we will make no attempt to be comprehensive. We only have 12 weeks in this semester and 11 more to go, so we are not going to be comprehensive. We will deal with a few texts. We will leave much, sadly, outside the door that we won't be able to at least directly engage with. However, we will do so out of the hope that if this works, it will hopefully be inspiring in the sense that you, for the rest of your lives, will continue to wrestle with the many ideas, the vast majority of which, of course, we will not have had time to get to in these 11 weeks to go. However, hopefully this will be the beginning of an incredibly powerful conversation that you will be actively involved with for the rest of your lives. So, as we go, you will often wonder, why in the world are we reading Confucius and not Lao Tzu? Why are we not reading all these ideas from vast cultural areas where these extraordinary religious movements were emerging that are not even being mentioned? The answer is, we don't have time. However, anything that you are reading that you'd like to bring in, please do after this course is ending. Hopefully you will continue doing that reading. So we will not be comprehensive. However, we hope that the juxtapositions we will be suggesting will be incredibly opening. Now let me also say a few words about the categories that we will have no choice but to use, but that we will try to be rethinking as we go. So you might at least think from what I've been saying, we'll either organize this in a strict chronological way, so ideas from the first half of the first millennium BCE, ideas from Salvationist religions, ideas from these revolutionary movements in the 19th and early 20th centuries. No, we're not even going to do that. So we will be jumping around, and we do so intentionally because when you put things in categories, including the ones that I've already begun using, that can be limiting. It can be limiting to think chronologically because it will give the sense, even if we don't want to believe this, and yet it can give us the sense in practice that these ideas from the first millennium BCE can only be understood in that context, which means we will read them into that context, not reading the powerful ideas that perhaps didn't work so well in the context or were overly shaped by that context, but that we could reread in a new way in a different context. We also do not want to restrict our thinking to cultural area. So as we discuss these ideas, we'll be mentioning western end of Eurasia, eastern end of Eurasia, but these are not initially ideas that are Western or Chinese or Indian. We absolutely do not want the ideas to be restricted to our definition of any of those three cultures that I just mentioned. And this will be important because two of these in particular are actively being built into imperial ideologies in the US and China, and that is occurring in ways that is, I'm sure, clear by now, we personally find very problematic. We do not want these ideas to again become domesticated for purposes of imperial legitimation. So we will actively be breaking chronology, cultural area, even terms like philosophy and religion, we will be actively rethinking. So a lot of the movements in the first millennium BCE are called philosophy just because the word philosophy is a Greek word, and the Greek figures we're called themselves philosophers, but they meant by that something dramatically grander than we currently tend to use the term as. These Salvationist religions, I just use the word religion, and I'm happy to do so, but as we will see, these are not religions in the way that we now tend to use the word, which is a very secularized Protestant definition of my individual personal belief in X, Y, or Z. These Salvationist religions were all about radically changing your life. So we will use the words philosophy and the word religion, but we will actively be rethinking them as we go to expand their possible meaning and prevent them from restricting our thinking. So chronology, cultural area, even the terms philosophy, religion, we will have to use all of these, but we will actively be rethinking all of them for, again, the explicit purpose of allowing us as much as possible to wrestle with these ideas in their most powerful articulations. Now, having said that, let me say a few more words on a much more mundane level about how we will accordingly be structuring this class. I keep saying structure to imply that there really is some, and there is a little bit. So the way we will be doing it is the following. We will start actually next week by looking at where the things I began this course, this discussion, came from. This idea that we should think of ethics in this very restricted sense of how rational individuals should ethically deal with each other. And we will look at that vision of philosophy. We will ask where it began. We will talk about its implications and its very evident restrictions. And from there, we will jump into these ideas, and that jumping will involve, as I've mentioned, jumping across centuries, millennia, and radically distant geographical areas, hopefully for an exciting intellectual purpose. Each week, we will be assigning what we think of as powerful ideas. Powerful does not mean nice ideas that we'll all agree with. Some of these you will really not agree with. That's fine, but we want to wrestle with them. And these will be tough and challenging readings in themselves, all the more so because even if you think, okay, I finally figured out the Buddha, or I finally figured out Nietzsche, you probably haven't. These are tough, but even if you did, the next week we're on to something totally different. That's the intent. We don't want us to feel comfortable with these ideas. We want to jump around, and with these juxtapositions, hopefully, that will help us wrestle with them all the more. So if you're going to feel lost over the course of these weeks, you will. And when you do, that's hopefully part of what will be exciting about this course. So each week, we will give you a set of readings. Sometimes we'll discuss those readings in depth. A lot of times we will use them as simply jumping off points for a much larger discussion. And we call on you to please feel free to do anything in that spectrum. You can come in and give a close reading of what Emerson says about X, Y, or Z, but a lot of our discussion also will be in the close reading of X, Y, or Z in Emerson, how do we rethink the topic at hand? And that question, a radical thinking through of what self-fashioning would mean. When we read the Buddha, same thing. How would we rethink ourselves if we actually are going to be rejecting the notion of a self? So our conversations will be trying to hit the big points, and as I mentioned, we, Roberto and I, will have opening discussions, and then we will open it up. When we open it up, you're of course more than welcome to ask us questions, but don't feel you need to be restricted to that. You are welcome to make arguments yourself based upon the readings, building on the readings, challenging us. Absolutely anything goes. You don't have to direct them toward us. You can make arguments back and forth to each other. One quick logistical thing I will mention, the acoustics in the room are not always great. You might have noticed you have microphones in front of you. We found those don't always work well, so we have microphones here. So what we will do is actually put one microphone on this side of the room, one on that side of the room, and when you make an argument, then you can hand it off to the next person on either side. So that way we can all hear each other, and our hope is to think of these 2 hours as a full conversation amongst all of us. Now, continuing on the more mundane side of the way we're ordering this course, let me say a few words about those 2 hours. You might all, without exception, regardless of which school you're coming in from, be wondering why we have the weird time that we have. So FAS, the Div School, and the law school all have different times that you're allowed to have courses in, and this course is working within none of them. so we figure it's fairer this way to break all the rules as opposed to following one rule and following another. So we will be meeting in this room according to what the syllabus says, which will not always correlate with what different schools on their website say because they have their set times. So our meeting will be, as the syllabus says, 3:45 to 5:45 every Wednesday here. We also will regularly do, so you've already seen it today, but this will be the regular practice, we will actually start 10 minutes after. So we'll actually start at 3:55. The reason is precisely because we're starting off time. Some people will be physically running from another place that will end at 3:45, depending on the schedule of their own school. So to give them times they don't actually have to physically run too quickly, we will always start at 3:55. We will always wrap up at 5:45. That will be our time together. We will, for the undergraduates, be setting up discussion sections. We will later be in contact about when those will be. So you'll have noticed you have not yet been able to sign up for them. That's because we haven't put them up yet, but we will be putting up those at a later date. In terms of assignments, for all of you, the final assignment will be calling on you to write about your ideas coming from this class. I put it very ambiguously because literally the prompt we will be giving you in the spring will read something like, please write a paper about anything that has come up in some manner, shape, or form in this class. I'm only slightly exaggerating. It is going to be very open-ended and intentionally so. We want you to be reading these texts, thinking big, wrestling with these ideas, and then in this final paper, you will be wrestling with them in any form you want to take, any piece of them, any body of material, in any way you want to. And we look forward to reading these and being excited by them. So you are welcome to do what you want, and we cannot wait to see what you're going to do. So this will not be a standard, well, certainly not a final exam, certainly not even a standard paper that would be given. We want you to use these to think big. Now, for the undergraduates, we will also give 2 other assignments, which will just be 2 shorter writing assignments over the course of the semester. We do this simply to allow you to begin formulating some ideas based upon the readings we're doing and getting early feedback. We will not be requiring those of the non-undergraduates. So for the non-undergraduates, you're free from it. For the undergraduates, think of it as hopefully a good thing, because it sort of will allow you to write some early thoughts and get some early feedback. And otherwise, that is how we will be structuring this course. So we hope you will take the course. We hope you will come in ready to think big and debate these incredibly challenging ideas. If you do so, I hope you will find this a wild, bizarre, but nonetheless intellectually incredibly exciting semester as we wrestle with what I think we can honestly call among the most powerful and challenging ideas that we know of from world history, and we will try to live up to the powers of those ideas. So any opening questions at this point before I turn things over to my colleague Roberto? The questions could be grand or big or very mundane about the logistics of how we will be running things. Great. Oh, yes, please.
You sort of nodded at it, but given that the class is technically housed at community schools,
Yes.
are there lenses in particular, like legal or rabbinic, like that inform those, or what?
Yes. So the answer, I was giving a negative answer, but actually I want to put it the exact opposite way, although with the same intent. I was going to say no lens, or the flip side, the optimistic way is to say all lenses. So the reason we have this across the different schools is, just as we were saying, we don't want these ideas to be restricted to a different chronological period or a cultural area. The exact same thing in the ways right now in the American university system, the way we divide and organize knowledge can be incredibly restrictive. So the more lenses, the better. So the lenses will come from a divinity school lens, a law school lens. From the FAS side, you have students from all sorts of different disciplines. The more, the better. And we would call all of you to bring in the disciplines and lenses you're working with to enlighten these ideas, but also be open to breaking your lenses and seeing the world from other lenses as we go. So we intentionally do it across several schools because we want people from several schools to be actively involved. We also have several from the Kennedy School, several from the Ed School. So the more the better. And our view is that's part of where these exciting discussions, the reason they can become so exciting is precisely because we have so many different lenses that will open up so many different perspectives. Great. Oh, yes, please. Of course. Oh, grading scale? Yes. So the answer is yes. Yeah, I see what you mean. No, it's a perfectly legitimate question. Yes. So if you sign up through FAS or HDS, it will be the same. It will be the standard A, B, C, D, F. I'm sure you won't be getting S, but that's grade scale. If you're signing up through the law school, it will be the law school grading. Yes. So if you're law school students, that's probably good. If you're not a law school student and you'd rather be on the AB system, et cetera, you may want to sign up through either FAS or HDS. Yes. Of course, absolutely. Great, please. Oh, no, we will definitely be weighing in. And, oh, yeah, no, we will absolutely be weighing in. Some of these ideas, I would say all of the ideas that we're introducing we find powerful to think with. A lot of them we find horrifying. We'll give an obvious example. We'll read Nietzsche, who is going to be an unbelievably powerful thinker, but oh my gosh, I mean, that is a scary thinker. and we will not paper over that scariness. I mean, this is a scary thinker who gets appropriated in dangerous ways, but there's certainly ideas that he's putting out that allowed that appropriation. It's not for nothing that Hitler's quoting Nietzsche, not Emerson. So yeah, we will wrestle with ideas that we find horribly dangerous, but that's important to do, because if something is dangerous and yet powerful, how do we deal with that? So yes, our views will be usually very, very evident, and feel free to challenge our views. I mean, so feel free, like when we're talking about Nietzsche, you can say, Michael, that's an overly mean reading of Nietzsche. There's more here than you're giving. Or other examples, you might say, Michael, that's an overly sympathetic reading. What about this next line? So we definitely will have our views. You are welcome to have your views, and we will challenge each other as we go. Great, well, let me turn things over to Roberto.
The only inescapable question we face is the question, how should we live our lives? And that's what you could call first-order ethics. And this is a course about first-order ethics, in which we engage the answers to this question, this inescapable question, from the standpoint of different understandings of the world. Now, I'm going to make a series of remarks, all intended in the spirit of contributing to the task that Michael began, of identifying the subject and theme of our course. The first set of remarks is about the human condition, which Michael mentioned as our concern throughout. We are dying organisms in a world which we barely understand. And all of the philosophical traditions and religions that we will examine are dealing with this situation, our situation in the world. In the human condition, there are irreparable flaws. And I'm going to list 3 or 4 of them now. The first is our mortality. We don't want to die, but we are going to die. No one is going to get out of here alive. We have this experience of vitality, of fecundity, surprise, spontaneity, and it's all going to be destroyed. It's going to be annihilated. And the people we love are also going to be annihilated. So that's the first thing that one could label an irreparable flaw in the human condition. The second is our groundlessness. We don't understand the framework of existence. So our lives have a vertiginous, dreamlike quality. Where are we? Why are we? Why is this world here? We're unable to peer into the beginning or the end of time. There's a little area that's lighted up of our explorations of the world, but all around it is darkness. And in some respects, the area of darkness is increasing because contemporary science has now taken in the 20th century a fateful step toward an understanding of nature that doesn't communicate with our experience. In relativity and quantum mechanics, if we add it all up, what has happened is that ideas that are central to the way in which we understand our own experience, the reality of time, the reality of causation, and therefore also the reality of change, are all being challenged or have been challenged by this tradition. In the 1920s, we discovered that the universe has a history. And if the universe is historical, in principle, every aspect of nature should be historical. But the main frameworks of modern science, the paradigms that animated quantum mechanics and relativity, emerged slightly before and not after this discovery of the historical character of the universe. And they have then led to this view that cuts the thread of communication between the way we explain and understand nature and the way we explain and understand ourselves. The result is that under this movement of science, the content of the propositions of natural science about the world seem to be locked up in their mathematical formulation. And every other way of explaining that content is merely metaphorical. The result has been to increase the area of darkness rather than to diminish it. We are groundless. We don't understand the framework of existence or being or reality. Every set of presuppositions or ideas or claims rests on other presuppositions, and the bottom is bottomless. And it's in that circumstance that we live. The third incurable flaw, well, let me say one more thing about that. If we were not mortal, as we are, our groundlessness would not be so disturbing, because we might think we always discover the truth later. But there will be no time to discover it. For us, for each of us, there'll be no time. We'll be gone. So our groundlessness acquires its weight against the background of our mortality. The third incurable flaw of the human condition is that we're insatiable. Our desires are insatiable. The Roman poet Ovid said, "The world is not enough. We want more. We want the world. We want more than the world." We have this experience of longing, satiation, boredom, and more longing. We're tied to this wheel of endless and unsatisfied desire. And our desires have a peculiar quality. They're relatively empty compared to how we imagine the desires of the other animals. They're indeterminate. And they are, on the one hand, mimetic. They're influenced by what other people desire. We desire what the others desire. And they're projected. In desiring a particular thing, it's always as if we desired it because of something else. There's more. There's a penumbra of longing around the particular desire. So we are radically incomplete. We want more. There's not enough. And there is a fourth flaw in the human condition, which has a different character, which is our susceptibility to belittlement. We all have an understanding of ourselves, and characteristically, we're not able to live it out. We're all like Hamlet, who is unable to live in the world as how he imagines himself to be. And this fourth desire is different because there, the possibility of realizing it crosses the line between ethics and politics, between the inalterable features of the human condition and the alterable circumstances of social life. Every society, every culture draws a line between the alterable circumstances of social life and the inalterable features of the human condition. And every society and every culture seems to draw that line in the wrong place, which is, in a sense, increases the puzzling, the disturbing, and subversive quality of this half flaw of the human condition, which I'm calling our susceptibility to belittlement. Now, what are the remedies that the human mind has prepared against these flaws? I'm now going to mention two: philosophy and religion. And what is philosophy? What has it been in the West? In the West, traditionally, philosophy, as it was understood for hundreds of years, was a super science, standing above the particular disciplines by which the philosopher, a superior mind, withdrawn from society, formulated an understanding of the world, of the situation, which he would then reveal to his contemporaries or to his posterity. That's what philosophy was from Aristotle to Hegel. It was this super science, standing above all of the particular disciplines and laying down, as it were, the law. Now, in fact, these philosophies were formed by individuals with very different temperaments. Arthur Schopenhauer, one of these great philosophers in the world, in the West, said a man's philosophy is the expression of his temperament. But in the preface to his masterwork, The World is Will and Representation, he had said, my philosophy is the definitive elucidation of the enigma of existence. These two propositions cannot both be true. So the philosophers had some understanding that they were claiming too much. But philosophy had a practical justification. And its practical justification was to be in aid of a form of self-help. Now, self-help for what? Self-help as a way of steeling oneself against the incurable flaws in the human condition, which I have just enumerated. So philosophy was, among other things, a way of composing oneself in the face of death. And in this situation of inability to understand the basic character of existence. Unless someone came and said, this is it, using some superior form of insight. That was the classical conception of philosophy. In the West, that conception was attacked from Kant and Hume onwards as a source of dogmatism, and rightly attacked, because the truth is that there is no super science. There is no privileged Archimedean place from which we can lay down the law to the other departments of the human mind, to the other forms of inquiry. Now what has resulted in much of the contemporary world, not in all of it, but in some parts, especially, for example, in the Anglo-American Academy, is a radically diminished conception of philosophy, in which philosophy, far from being the super science, is now a thought police. It teaches you how to argue what is legitimate and illegitimate. And the trouble for this thought police is that no one is really interested in what it does. So the practitioners of the work of the thought police end up talking to each other, surrounded by the silence of humanity. So these two conceptions of philosophy are unusable. What then is the conception of philosophy to which I am going to appeal in my interventions here in our course? Has to be a third conception. Philosophy is the mind at war, insisting on our prerogative to talk about what matters most, and insisting on it through the effort to combat the orthodoxies of all the particular disciplines. The particular disciplines, if we list them all together, if we enumerate them as they are collected in the university culture, claims to represent the whole of our understanding. But it doesn't represent the whole of our understanding. We have ways of criticizing the disciplines from the inside and from the outside. The disciplines as they are now established, the orthodoxies that claim to be the truth, do not exhaust our insight into the world. We can rebel. And philosophy, if it's to be anything, must be this rebellion rather than just the work of the thought police. That's the conception of philosophy that I want to enact in my interventions here. Now, religion is a historical phenomenon. And for much of the early history of humanity, religion was dominated by our concerns about our dependence on nature, the terrors of nature, the benefits of nature. As these civilizations were organized and began to control nature, the focus on our dependence on nature shifted to the focus on the incurable defects in the human condition. And a different kind of religion, a different meaning of religion resulted. And especially in the long revolutionary period between the rise of prophetic Judaism and the prophetic activity of Muhammad. That period includes, notably, religions such as Buddhism. And if you were to call it a religion, which I think we should regard it as, Confucianism. All the decisive major spiritual orientations of humanity were defined in that 1,000-year historical period. In three main directions, and that will then be the first great structural theme of our course, the mapping of these major directions. There'll be one direction which is exemplified by Buddhism and by the religion of the Vedas, many of the philosophies of ancient India, which we could call the overcoming of the world. In the vocabulary of the history of philosophy, a speculative monism. It says, the divisions in the world, the divisions in reality, the distinctions, and the changes, the transformations, are all illusory or epiphenomenal. They're not the real reality. The real reality is unified, is undivided, and is unchanging. And if only we could establish communion with that one reality, we could free ourselves from this torture of insatiable longing and achieve, through this liberation, serenity and benevolence. The second orientation is exemplified by Confucianism. And it said, it was based on an anti-metaphysical metaphysics. We can't understand the world. We can barely control it. It's meaningless. But in this meaningless cosmos, we can create meaning. We can create a world that bears the imprint of our humanity. We can humanize it. The way we humanize it is by a double operation of assuming and discharging the obligations that we have to one another by virtue of the roles that we occupy, affirming our interdependence, and on the other hand, by forming a mind, a sensibility that is able to imagine the others, the imagination of the otherness of the others. If there is anything sacred in the world, the sacred is the interpersonal. Solidarity is the only real metaphysics. The third orientation is the orientation exemplified by the Semitic monotheism. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And they claimed that there is a process of transformation of reality and of the self that can lift us up from this flawed life that we have to a higher life and even to an eternal life. Because humanity is in communion with a transcendent God who created the world out of a surfeit of love, and that our interaction with him, the human response to divine grace, can produce a transformation that frees us from the chains of insatiable desire and of mortality itself. Our Western civilization was formed against the background of Christianity. And I think it's fair to say that the highest achievements of our culture, like the plays of Shakespeare, or the philosophy of Hegel, we can't really regard as Christian. Shakespeare and Hegel almost certainly regarded themselves as devout Christians. But if we now look at what they said and wrote and thought and ask, is that Christianity? The answer is very doubtful. The highest achievements of culture in the West are all formed in the penumbra of Christianity. They're not Christian, it seems, but they're unthinkable without Christianity. So the first set of divisions with which we're going to deal in the course is the division between these three orientations. Overcoming the world, the speculative monism. Humanizing the world by affirming the primacy of the logic of the interpersonal. Overcoming the world by engaging the narrative of redemption and transformation. We could put them on a sliding scale from those that are easier to believe and harder to believe. The hardest to believe is the last one. The transformation of the world with its narrative of redemption and the scandals of reason, the scandal of the breaking of the causal connections in the world, to the miraculous intervention of the transcendent deity in human history. There's the scandal of universality and particularity. This is a universal message in Christianity, the message of the primacy of love. Love, not altruism. But the universal message is conveyed through a particularistic plot, which is accidental and seems to be arbitrary. Why was Christ born? Why did God become incarnate in a peripheral province of the Roman Empire? And why then, at that time, rather than earlier or later? And then finally, there's the scandal of the incomprehensibility of God. In these Semitic monotheisms, is God to be conceived as a person in a direction which seems to be anthropomorphic, as a being in the language of Greek philosophy, or just negatively as non-being and non-person? So that would be the best possible news that we could get. The best possible news is that we have a friend in charge of the universe, God. But it's the hardest to believe. Then we go down the sliding scale to Buddhism, to the speculative monism. That's maybe easier to believe. But the news is not so good. Because the message seems to be that the best way to deal with the terrors of life is to die beforehand. By saying we were not really alive as these embodied individuals to start with. We were just part of this one unchanging reality. And then in the third position would be the humanization of the world, exemplified by Confucianism. So it's the easiest to believe because of its anti-metaphysical metaphysics. But the news might be thought to be not as good, because it requires us then not to embark on some transformation, some roller coaster of changes that will lead to eternal life, but simply to assume the primacy of solidarity, of our obligations to the other, to the others. Now, all those religions formed in a historical period, this 1,000-year period of the religious revolution, and taking these, what seems to be these radically different directions that I just summarized. But what is remarkable is that despite the radical differences among these orientations, they do have something in common. And what do they have in common? What do these religious revolutions have in common that produce these world religions? First, they have in common the desanctification of nature. Nature was the God before. So the subversion of what you could call cosmotheism. The world, the natural world is the divine. that idea was renounced, attacked, destroyed. The second thing they have in common is to establish some dialectic, some interplay between transcendence and immanence. The divine, having been separated from nature, must now become re-embodied in the world, even in the humanization of the world, even in Confucianism. This higher form of social life, of the moral logic of the interpersonal, is the divine, and it must be embodied in the world. And it's then this interplay, this dialectic between the divine which transcends the world and then the divine which is re-embodied in the world, which becomes crucial. And the human being is embodied spirit, the spirit incarnate. We would say in the language of the third tradition, of the Semitic monotheism and of the transformation of the world. The third thing that they had in common is that they all denied the ultimate reality and sanctity of the divisions within mankind. The divisions of caste, of class, of race, of all the divisions. They said these divisions are superficial and affirm the unity of humanity. The fourth thing that they had in common is astonishing. They all attacked the dominant ethic of the civilizations in which they arose. The dominant ethic was the ethic of the warrior caste or class, of vengeful, proud self-assertion, the ethic of honor, the ethic of little boys who say, don't diss me. This was the ethic of humanity before them. And they didn't repudiate those ethics by saying, we'll attenuate them. They turned them around completely, radically. Christ said, turn the other cheek. He commanded us to do something that seems impossible, which is to love the stranger. So impossible that later on, the ethical philosophers in the semi-Christianized culture of Europe offered us, instead of impossible love, the cold shoulder of an impersonal and altruistic benevolence as the core of their moral ideas. We'll discuss next week. How was it possible that something so unworldly could be accepted and embraced by these civilizations, by these cultures, one after the other? They didn't just say, we'll control it, we'll moralize it, we'll make it more pietistic or responsible. They said, we'll do the opposite. And this happened all over the world in this astonishing period in the spiritual life of humanity. Now, there's one more thing that they had in common, these spiritual orientations. They were all like a two-sided ticket. One side of the ticket was an offer to escape from the world to another world. The other side of the ticket was an invitation to change the world in a particular direction. All of the features that I've listed that these spiritual orientations had in common had this ambivalence. Were they a way of redescribing the world, or were they a way of changing the world? Were they saying, for example, that the slave and the master are really the same, but we don't need to abolish slavery, Or were they saying, we have to end slavery? This is the ambiguity of these spiritual orientations that continued for centuries afterwards. So that's going to be a large part of the beginning of this course. The study of these orientations, having all these elements in common that I just listed, but nevertheless being departures in radically different directions. And my attitude to them, speaking for myself, is not as a believer in any of them, but also not as a disinterested skeptic, attempting to carry out that idea of philosophy that I described before and called the mind at war. Now, there's one more set of remarks that I want to make to describe the structural division that will be paramount in the latter part of the course. When we come to the contemporary world, we find two ethical orientations that are particularly influential in the world today. And they're not ethical orientations in the sense of the kind of ethics that's studied in the American and English universities. They're not a moralistic legalism. They're not a pharisaical study of the obligations that we have towards one another. That's not what they're about. They're about the road up, our transformation, and the transformation of society. They're not about the bill. They're not a bill of obligation, what we owe to one another. They're about our hopes. What can we become? What can we make of ourselves and of our society? These two ethics that now have greatest influence in the world are an ethic of self-fashioning and nonconformity. That's the first. It had its philosophers, like Emerson or Nietzsche. But its philosophers don't really give an adequate account of it. Its ideal is autonomy. That the individual living in the present moment, now, in time, can take full possession of life. By making war on conventional morality, on the prejudices of society, by throwing out the script that society hands him and rebelling. A radicalized ideal of autonomy, which disturbingly seems to be empty. What's the content of autonomy? Autonomy ultimately seems to be expressed in our connections and engagements. It has to have a substance. Otherwise, we'll fight for all of this freedom. But then when we have it, we won't know what to do. We'll be like Lear saying, I shall do such things I know not what, but they will be the terrors of the earth. And that ethic has been anchored historically in one of the two great superpowers of the present moment, the United States. Just as the other ethic, which I'm now going to speak to, has been anchored in the other superpower, China. The other ethic is an ethic of role, responsibility, and connection. Now, I'm going to argue in the course that there is no true synthesis possible between these two ethics. But that at the same time, the forms that they take, influenced by the cultures of these two great powers, are defective, radically defective. And that to reformulate them, we should revise both of them. We should try to recreate them in a stronger form. And one of the things we have to do in order to be able to recreate them is to throw out the dust of history. The dust of history is the bric-a-brac that they have acquired by virtue of their association with these two superpowers. That to revise each of them in a form that deserves the attention of humanity, that compels study and engagement, we would have to take out these contingent features that they have by virtue of these historical associations. Now, I want to say one more thing. The dominant attitude now toward religion in much of the world, especially by the educated and propertied classes, is a situation of half belief. They want to believe. William James said, people believe everything they can. And the typical attitude is they half believe. So the propositions of Christianity, for example, in a semi-Christianized society are not really believed in, but treated as if they were metaphorical expressions of some moral conception. And this situation is very unsatisfactory. First, because it leads to a form of self-deception in which people can fool themselves about their faith. And second, because the religious sensibility formed in the climate of this half-belief has as its content the conventional pieties of the day, the political correctness, the moral truism. We don't need religion for that. What does humanity need for that? Why have just another way of restating the conventional pieties? Religion is to be a storm and take us in a direction that we didn't imagine. Now, both these ethical orientations that I described, the ethic of connection, of responsibility, and the ethic of self-fashioning and nonconformity, arose in a moment of history long after that revolutionary period that formed the world religion. That will be the initial subject of our study in the course. But they arose in what is also a revolutionary period in the history of humanity. In the last 200 or 300 years, the whole world has been on fire. And there has been a revolutionary project that has transformed the whole world. And this revolutionary project has had two sides. one side has been political and about society. And it has been carried by the doctrines of liberalism, socialism, and democracy. And the other side has been personalist. The political side carried the message that the grid of division and hierarchy weighing on social life will be lifted definitively, and humanity will be pushed up by this lifting, by this war against the class structure and against division and hierarchy generally. The personalist side has been carried by romanticism, and especially by the worldwide popular romantic culture, as well as by the high culture of romanticism of the 19th century. The movies, the music, heard and seen in every village and every slum in the world, and carrying to all of humanity the sublime message that the ordinary man and woman is not so ordinary after all, but has the possibility of divinization. The message is that it's not enough to humanize society. The aim is to divinize humanity. And this revolutionary project has changed the whole world. Now there's a problem. This continues to be the strongest project in the world today. This project I've just described, with its two sides, the political and the romantic. But its votaries, like me, I'm an adept of this project, no longer know what its next steps should be, on either the political side or the personalist side. And if the project cannot be reinvented, it cannot live. It can live only if we reinvent it. And that is what I see as the essential program of this course. The course is focused not on the political side, but on the personalist side. And the debate about the conduct of life is a debate about what should be the next steps on the personalist side in the question of how I shape a life, what I think of life, against this background of obscurity and enigma. So, speaking for myself, I hope that our deeds and our thoughts will not be shaped by the biases of the counter-revolutionary interlude in which our lives happen to have fallen. Speaking hopefully, because I want and expect the revolution to continue, I have to think of the period in which I was born and thinking and here as an interlude. And I don't want that interlude. I don't want the biases of that interlude to determine how I think, how I act. And from my standpoint, that's what the course is about.
Wonderful. Let us open this up. Comments, questions, responses. We know you haven't read anything coming in, but that's part of the point. We want you to feel free to raise your thoughts. And Steve will run around the microphones. They can be grand, they can be small, they can be specific, they can be overarching. Please, yes.
I'm just gonna, does this work or should I use the microphone?
Yeah, these work a lot better than the ones on the table. Oh yeah, you have to, it's near the bottom, yeah.
There we go. Okay. Oh, this sounds much better. Oh, much less
Great.
echo. Yeah, I'm very curious when we talk about the ethical orientation in the United States, transformation society.
I think, at least the way a lot of us have studied U.S. history is there is a lot of conformity that we see, especially in society. We look at things like a lot of the Protestant work ethic, that culture that still permeates. And so I guess, how do you reconcile the fact that we as a society have developed in different phases of conformity with the idea that we have developed with this idea of superseding that conformity?
I think that was one of the subjects of Tocqueville in his account of the United States in its formative period. There was a conformist society, in a society the religion of which was nonconformity. That's a paradoxical aspect of the society. And forever this has been a theme in the American presentation of the United States. The crowd, the conformist crowd. From Emerson to David Reisman. It's a continuing theme. So the root is the message of the American prophets. Lincoln, Emerson, Whitman. And what was their message? Their message was that the individual is not just in connection with God, the individual is God. And this led to what Harold Bloom called the American religion. That is, in the United States, there have been three main forms of religious sensibility. There's been the Orthodox churches, Protestant and Catholic. Then there has been the secular humanism, which is a secularization of Christian morality. And then there has been what Bloom called the American religion, the religions that the Americans invented, like Mormonism, Jehovah's Witnesses, Seventh-day Adventists. And the theme of these religions that the Americans invented was the divinity of the individual. The individual is a part of God. And that's the voice in which these American prophets spoke. Now, as far as I'm concerned, from the very beginning, the message of the American prophets was corrupt in two crucial respects. There was a double blot on the message. The first is it had a disturbed conception of the relation between self-construction and solidarity. The message was, you become an individual, you become autonomous, you become stronger, richer, more powerful, greater, and then as a result you can be generous. Your generosity is the gift of your strength, of your wealth, of your prosperity. That's not the relation between solidarity and self-construction. Solidarity is intrinsic to self-construction. It's not something that comes afterwards. That was the first objection to the message. The second objection is institutional idolatry. They were supposedly Christian. For a Christian, this is an abomination to say that there is a sanctified set of institutions. They're all dust in the face of God, these institutions. A Christian has to believe that we disrespect institutions in order to respect individuals. The extreme expression of this institutional ideology is the cult of the Constitution as a once-and-for-all document, to which, for example, Thomas Jefferson was inalterably opposed. Jefferson believed that the Constitution should be trashed every 2 generations so that the living wouldn't be governed by the dead. But that was, so I would say, the prophets of liberation were mistaken in the message. It's not enough to say, now let's fulfill the message of the American prophets. belatedly without correcting the message. And the flaws in the message interacted with the result. The result was the creation of this conformist mass. So that some discourse would go along those lines. Nevertheless, continuing now this historical disquisition, there is something remarkable about the United States socially and structurally, which is that in the 19th century, in the North, the South was a slave regime. But the North was an economy of petty proprietors and tradesmen. Property owning. When Tocqueville visited the United States in the 1830s, only one white man in 5 worked for another white man. That means that the great majority of the American people in the North were self-employed, independent proprietors, who cooperated or not. And this corresponds to what the dream, the project of society in the 19th century, defended not just by the socialists, but by the liberals, like John Stuart Mill. It wasn't to have what ended up being welfare state capitalism. It was to have a property-owning democracy. But this idea could not be realized because the liberals and socialists found no way to accommodate the relentless imperative of economies of scale, of aggregating resources. So after the Civil War, that was achieved by money, by capital, by the plutocracy, by the banks, which had been prohibited from operating in more than one state of the Union and were then allowed to operate freely, and by the corporation. So that's the summary of obviously a long story. But that's another part of the answer to your question of how could a society whose profits were profits of autonomy become a bunch of conformists? The answer there's a spiritual part of the answer, and there's a structural part of the answer.
Yes, please.
Thank you. In your characterization of the two crucial ethical orientations today and in what religion has become today, it sounds as if something's missing, and that is just the religious fundamentalism, the radical fundamentalism that we see in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam today in many places and formations that simply seems irreducible to what I'm understanding to be your characterization. So could you talk more about that, about where they fit into the picture in terms of not being individualistic, not being having these characteristics that you were emphasizing?
You state that for me?
Oh, sure. So where would we...
I didn't hear part of it.
Oh, yes. So where would religious fundamentalism be situated in this?
So I think it's a part of this, right?
Yes.
That the masses with less educational opportunity form then a literalist view of the religion and its message. The elite escapes to the situation as half belief. So either the religion is reduced to what it wasn't supposed to be. Christianity was supposed to be the religion of love, not the religion of law. A powerful antinomian element. The two central themes in the Christian vision are love, the primacy of love over altruism, and second, infinity, the transcendence of the individual. There's more in us, in each of us as individuals, and in all of us collectively, the human race than there is or ever can be in the laws, in the institutions, in the structure. I think the relation between love and infinity is the crucial theological theme in Christianity. And I think that the fundamentalism, which can be explained sociologically as a flight from the religion of love to the religion of law, which fundamentally, to my mind, misdescribes the nature of Christianity. Christianity is the revolt against the Pharisees, against the law. The Redeemer says, I came to fulfill the law, but the law is fulfilled by being defied and by affirming the primacy of love.
Yes, please. Thank you, Steve.
Yeah, this question's first for Professor Unger, but I'd like to extend it to Professor Pewitt. But I caught on to when you said that you described yourself as an adept of the project of the divinization of human nature. And I was fascinated by your word choice there of calling yourself an adept. And often the word adept is associated with the word initiation or being initiated into being an adept. So I'm curious, first, initiation is associated often when talking about being an adept. So I'm curious to hear you elaborate maybe a bit of why you call yourself an adept to this project.
I'm sympathetic to this revolutionary project. It's not complicated. I want it to continue. But I think that to continue, it has to be radically reinvented. So the transformation can't occur in the form or with the content that it had in the 19th century. To continue. Now, what's the situation? Let me give a concrete example. So, take the theory of justice of the most influential political philosopher in the United States, John Rawls. On its face, it appears to be a radical egalitarianism, defending the interests of the poorest, the most vulnerable. In practice, it is a pseudo-philosophical gloss on the homely practices of compensatory redistribution under institutionally conservative social democracy. So it has no structural content, how you would reorganize the economy or anything like that. It says, given this structure of the market, you should redistribute and redistribute the most possible according to these principles. Now, of course, the redistribution can't be radical because you can't organize a system according to a certain set of arrangements and assumptions and then say, we'll take it all back through a retrospective operation. Obviously, the compensatory redistribution will have to be very limited in order to accommodate the incentives and the arrangements. And the structural change influencing the primary distribution of advantage and opportunity in the market will overshadow infinitely the secondary distribution that results from this retrospective correction by progressive taxation and redistributive social spending. Now, this has practical implications for the United States. The leaders of the putative Progressive Party in the United States, the Democratic Party, seem to have imagined that the good thing would be for the United States to become like the Sweden of 1970. That's their idea of progress. And it's a fantastical vision of what the Sweden of 1970 was. But it's an idea that, you have the system, the arrangements of the market in place, and then you give everyone entitlements in order to humanize that system. So the progressives then are the humanizers of the inevitable. They're the people who bring the sugar, who sugarcoat the system. Now, to be fair, because I'm saying that that's what Rawlsianism has become. That wasn't what Rawls wanted. He was horrified. He thought that the most important part of his book on the theory of justice was the little section on property-owning democracy as a superior alternative to welfare state capitalism. And he was a genuine Christian, a believing Christian. But I think there's some confusion there. There's some fundamental misconception of the relation between the instrument and the idea.
That makes sense. And if I may, I also did want to extend it to Professor Pewitt of, do you consider yourself an adept in any project or would use that language for yourself?
Oh, I fully agree. So the reason Roberto and I started teaching this course, this is going back a few years, but tellingly so, we are in a period in American history of unbelievable complacency, and I would expand that for most of the world, but sticking with America is the obvious example since that's where we're situated. A period where, to give you some obvious examples, we started a little bit after the moment I'm about to mention, but as a telling example, in the 1990s, the two major political parties, one of the biggest debates that was going on was, should the highest tax rate on the wealthiest Americans be 34% or 32%? That was the debate. I mean, just like no one, you're getting no significant debate.
To be fair to the Americans, let's remind ourselves that in the war, the highest rate of personal income tax was over 90%.
Over 90%.
So
over 90.
Even though the Americans seem to be devoted to these sanctities of the free market, when they needed to, they cast them all off.
Absolutely.
As if they had never really believed in that stuff.
Yes.
And the result was that between 1942 and 1945, the GDP of the United States more than doubled.
Yes,
It was a sensational outcome, running the economy on principles totally opposite to the principles which they had earlier professed.
Exactly.
But no one then began to say, what we need is a war economy without a war. So in other words, the lessons of the war economy were abandoned and not treated as relevant to the reorganization of the peacetime economy.
Yes.
And ideas matter.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So you get this extraordinary complacency. This was a period when it would seem painfully obvious in the midst of this complacency that we had a series of policies that were obviously just going to explode. You're creating wealth inequality at world historical levels. You're devastating the environment. And, the parallels were obvious. If you follow the policies of neoliberalism, the neo, of course, is referring to the earlier period of liberalism. That earlier period, late 19th, early 20th centuries, of course, ends in the 1930s with the emergence of these right-wing populist movements. Wasn't that the obvious outcome of policies? And yet, meanwhile, 32 versus 34% is the level of the debate. Well, surprise, surprise, now that system is beginning to explode, but exploding exactly as it did in the 1930s with the emergence of these right-wing populist movements, which was totally predictable 2 decades ago. So I say that just as an example. The level of complacency is extraordinary, and the degree to which we are capable of accepting a situation that just seems obviously horrific and is obviously leading to an extraordinarily dangerous situation, and yet the ability of people to accept that and keep going on with their daily lives is horrifying. And I use that as just the more immediate example of something we were mentioning earlier too. These incredible levels of complacency can set in and last for extraordinary periods of time. So yes, the reason we teach this course is we want to ask, why is it in certain moments that you get a willingness to radically rethink the world? What stops that? Why are we in a period where it's stopped? And what in the world can we do to open that up again? And we think one of the clear places, in part because of the professions we've chosen, but I would argue it's a great place anyway, is in the sphere of education. That's where people can be helped and inspired to rethink the world. And our hope is in this field of education to do what we can to do so, which is why we teach this course.
I think, Michael, the one thing that I should have remarked on and didn't was this. The kind of discussion we need here and we want is a discussion that must violate an important taboo of liberal culture, which is the liberal taboo against the religious criticism of religion. It formed initially in the climate of the wars of religion. So it is a taboo to attack a religion in the name of a religion, because that's the ultimate evil under. But we can't accept that stricture. We have to have complete freedom. So a person who takes religion seriously has to be free to criticize religion from the standpoint of religion. And that's what you're not supposed to do in a liberal culture, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. No, and one of the things we will see repeatedly is in a liberal culture, we'll begin this discussion next week, in fact, in a liberal culture, the claim is, oh, anything goes, anything can be debated. In practice, that is exactly what is prevented from happening. And so the question is, how do we create spaces where everything is opened up again? Yes. And again, we think the educational sphere is a absolutely key place to do this. Please, yes.
I can stop early. How much systemic change do you need to have like a system? So an example is you mentioned like people are complacent, and this creates these like big, like right-wing populist pushbacks. I could imagine someone like justifying those right-wing populist pushbacks as someone trying to rethink radically a world, whether that's like, I don't know, but politicians today or like Hitler or whatever. Like those feel like some sort of radical rethinking, but that are just really bad. And that luckily in one of those cases like was wrapped up, and then hopefully soon will be wrapped, whatever. Those are obviously not centuries-long periods of new ideas and new thoughts and radical reframings, but they do seem not complacent, if that makes sense.
I agree.
Can you talk more about the idea of complacency and how complacent a society needs to be to qualify?
What would be an educational program worthy of a democracy? So I would say, in a country that is large, unequal, and federal in structure like the United States, or like my country, Brazil, you have to reconcile the local management of the schools by the states and the municipalities with national standards of investment and quality. The school should be in a democracy, the school should be the voice of the future. Should not be the instrument of the state that wants obedient citizens and soldiers, or the family that wants to reproduce itself in the child. The school should be the future. And in order to have a space in which to experiment, it has to be able to throw its enemies against one another. The family on the one hand and the state on the other hand. And it should have a pedagogic program oriented in a very particular direction. Because in most countries in the world, not in the United States, but in most countries, there are national curriculums. And the national curriculums are an infantilization of the orthodoxies of the university culture. So the university culture embodies the orthodox view of how to think and how to argue in each discipline. And the simplified version of that, the version for children, is in the national curriculum. So young people are emasculated and delivered to the higher stages of the university for a life, ready for a life of intellectual civility. We shouldn't want that in a democracy. So what should the program, the curricular program of the school be? First, it should privilege the analytic and synthetic capabilities of the imagination over the mastery of dead information. Second, its central theme should be transformation of nature and of society, because the way we understand anything is to understand how it changes. If we don't understand how a phenomenon changes, we don't understand it, period. It's retrospective rationalization rather than insight. Third, these intellectual capabilities are not acquired in a vacuum of content. They're acquired in dealing with content. But with respect to content, there should be selective deepening rather than encyclopedic superficiality. Fourth, the concept of a classical education has to be radically reinvented. So like in the West, it was a study of the Greek and Latin antiquity. In China, it was a study of the Confucian canon. The idea was that the mind should be formed with a third eye, able to look at the present from the vantage point of a completely different situation, remote in time and space. And in this case, with some genealogical relation to the present society. What was wrong about that was the dogmatic character of the canon, of the classical canon. So the canon has to be rendered radically plural, but the idea has to be preserved. In its social setting, the school should use the cooperative methods of advanced science from the very start. Cooperation among students, among teachers, among schools, in presence and remote, cooperation in every stage. Not in a dogmatic defense of the idea of cooperation, but in exemplifying it in its practice. And fifth, and most importantly, all education should be dialectical. Nothing should be studied just once. Everything should be studied at least twice from opposing points of view. That's the only way to study anything, and that's the only way to liberate the mind. So if this method of education is adopted, rather than the half of it represented by Dewey's progressive ideas on education, the child will be delivered to the higher stages of education already immunized against the intellectual servility for which he would otherwise be prepared. So that's the program that I would argue for, the educational program. So I think that in every domain of experience, there is a program which reflects the transformative idea. And this is a form of national liberation. Sarmiento in Argentina in the 19th century, Vasconcelos in Mexico in the 20th century. These were doctrines of liberation, reforming the country through the change of its education system. That is one of the ways to reform it.
Wonderful, and I think that is a perfect place to end today's discussion. Thank you so much for joining us. We hope you'll be back next week where we will continue this conversation, turning to Derek Parfit's attempt to synthesize all possible knowledge in a way that you will not be surprised we will be somewhat unconvinced by. I suspect that will be true for you too, but we will hopefully use that as a wonderful starting off point for our larger discussions. Thank you all so much, and hopefully see you next week.